Some killers lurk in shadows. Others blend into crowds. But the 5 you're about to hear about, they hid in plain sight, using their jobs not just to make a living, but to kill. From hospital wards to city taxi ranks, from butcher shops to police patrol cars, even inside funeral homes where death was supposed to be routine. These weren't strangers with masks or monsters in the woods. They were the nurse at your bedside, the driver who picked you up at midnight, the officer who promised to protect you. They didn't just kill, they weaponized trust. These are the 5 most ruthless killers who use their everyday jobs as hunting grounds, and each one is darker than the last. Before we begin, tell us what country you're watching from in the comments. Please subscribe if you want more stories like this, because what you're about to hear, you won't find it on Netflix. Hospitals are supposed to be the safest place in the world. Bright lights, beeping monitors, professionals trained to save lives. But for Alan Mercer, a night shift nurse in the 1990s Midwest, the hospital was more than just a workplace. It was his private hunting ground. Mercer understood something no one else wanted to admit. In a place where people die every day, one more death barely raises suspicion. That truth became his camouflage. Patients knew him as soft-spoken, attentive, the kind of caregiver who held their hand in the dark hours of the night. But that mask hid something sadistic. Mercer wasn't helping patients, he was experimenting on them. He developed a method that was chillingly simple. Late into his shift, when the hallways grew quiet and families had gone home, he'd enter patient rooms carrying a syringe hidden in his pocket. He injected paralytics, drugs designed to still the muscles, into IV lines. Within minutes, patients would struggle to breathe, their bodies shutting down. To colleagues, it looked like a sudden collapse, a natural decline. To Mercer, it was control. He lingered long enough to hear the alarms, then stepped back into the hallway, blending in with the rush of doctors and nurses, trying desperately to revive the very patients he had doomed. Mercer killed for power, not mercy. Later testimony would reveal his obsession wasn't with easing suffering, as some so-called angels of mercy claim. His notes, scribbled in a private diary, used words like silent, messy, and quick. Each entry corresponded to a patient's death, like a scientist recording outcomes in an experiment. Why did he kill? Because he could. Because he stood at the threshold of life and death every day and realized no one was watching closely enough to stop him. His weapon was trust itself, the trust patients gave him as they closed their eyes, believing he was there to heal them. His lures were effortless, no need for back alleys or fake promises. The hospital handed him victims nightly. Disposal was just as seamless. Unlike killers who drag bodies to rivers or forests, Mercer left his where they lay, knowing the paperwork would call it natural causes or complications. For years, this worked. Families buried loved ones thinking disease had claimed them, never suspecting a predator with a stethoscope had stolen their lives. Mercer walked away from every crime unseen, his uniform and badge of professionalism the perfect disguise. Alan Mercer's downfall began the way many long-hidden killers are finally unmasked, with whispers that turned into patterns too obvious to ignore. At first, colleagues brushed off the oddity that so many patients coded during his night shifts. Hospitals are chaotic by nature, death is routine, and Mercer seemed too quiet, too unremarkable to suspect. But one young nurse noticed the trend. She started keeping her own log of codes and quickly realized that the highest number of unexplained deaths always aligned with Mercer's schedule. That log made its way to administrators and from there to hospital investigators who decided to dig deeper. What they found was chilling. When Mercer worked, the mortality rate spiked. When he took days off, the numbers dropped to normal levels. It was the first red flag strong enough to force an inquiry. Administrators began quiet monitoring. They sent pharmacy techs to double-check medication records, only to find anomalies. Paralytics were missing in small amounts, doses that couldn't be explained by official prescriptions. Surveillance cameras showed Mercer slipping into patient rooms at odd hours, sometimes minutes before a code blue sounded. Still, suspicion isn't proof, and Mercer's calm demeanor shielded him. That changed when a janitor discovered a small leather notebook tucked behind Mercer's locker. It wasn't a diary in the traditional sense. It was a kill log, names, room numbers, and cryptic comments like old woman, blue lips, quick, or young male, restless, messy. The chilling thing wasn't just the accuracy, but the pride. Each line was written like an experiment carefully recorded for later review. Once that book was in investigators' hands, the trap was set. Detectives worked with hospital staff to secretly test IV bags from Mercer's patients. Within days, they found traces of muscle relaxants in bags that were never supposed to contain them. Confronted, Mercer remained disturbingly calm. He didn't deny, he didn't beg. He simply shrugged and said, "People die here every day. How can you prove which ones were mine?" That arrogance sealed his fate. Prosecutors built their case around the notebook, the missing drugs, and the spikes in mortality during his shifts. Families who had once accepted natural causes were told their loved ones had been murdered. The shock was unbearable. Mothers wept. Sons clenched their fists. Entire families realized their trust had been betrayed in the one place meant for safety. The trial was harrowing. Survivors among staff testified about Mercer's strange calm during emergencies, his quiet presence in rooms before sudden declines. Experts explained how paralytics work, how they suffocate patients silently, and how hard they are to detect once metabolism clears the body. Prosecutors told the jury that Mercer's real death toll could stretch into the hundreds, far more than they could prove. Mercer himself sat stone-faced, occasionally smirking when particularly graphic testimony described his methods. When given the chance to speak, he offered no apology. Instead, he said, "Life ends. I just made it predictable." That single sentence sealed his image as not just a killer, but a man who saw murder as routine. Mercer was sentenced to multiple life sentences without parole. In prison, he lived quietly, avoided by inmates and guards alike, his reputation staining him as both cowardly and monstrous. But the damage went far beyond his cell. His crimes changed hospital protocols nationwide. Medication access tightened, surveillance increased, and angels of mercy became a new term in criminology, used to describe medical staff who murder under the guise of care. For families, though, there was no policy strong enough to restore trust. Mercer proved that sometimes the most dangerous killers don't lurk in alleys or stalk in shadows. Sometimes they wear scrubs, smile softly, and walk the fluorescent halls of hospitals with syringes hidden in their pockets. If Alan Mercer weaponized trust inside hospitals, the next killer weaponized romance itself. He didn't use syringes or IV lines. He used love, marriage, and promises as the bait for murder. Love is supposed to mean safety, a promise to protect, a vow to stay loyal. But for Daniel Rowe, love was bait. He wasn't handsome, but he was clever. He knew how to charm women who were lonely, vulnerable, or desperate to believe someone cared. He worked as a car salesman in Ohio during the late 1980s, a job that let him meet people every day. He used the same skills that sold cars to sell himself: easy smiles, soft words, and promises of a future. Most of his victims were women in their 30s or 40s who had come out of painful divorces or failed relationships. They wanted stability. Daniel promised it. But what they got was death. Rowe's motive was money and control. He didn't kill out of rage. He killed to strip women of everything they had: their savings, their homes, their jewelry. His method followed a clear pattern. He would court a woman, date her for months, and then rush her into marriage. Within weeks, he would take out insurance policies, always naming himself the sole beneficiary. Then, he would wait. When the right moment came, Rose staged accidents. One wife was found drowned in a bathtub. Her death ruled accidental until bruises on her arms told a different story. Another was discovered at the bottom of a staircase, her neck broken. Rowe claimed she had tripped while carrying laundry, but the blood spatter suggested she had been struck first. His weapon of choice was whatever fit the scene: blunt objects, hands, water. He didn't stick to one tool because sticking to one meant leaving a pattern. He wanted each death to look like tragedy, not murder. The way he lured his victims was almost invisible. Friends described him as attentive, always the man carrying groceries, fixing cars, smiling at family gatherings. But that attention was strategy. He studied his wives, learned their weaknesses, then used those very weaknesses to kill. One wife was terrified of water. Daniel convinced her to take a bath to relax, then held her under until her struggles stopped. Another was afraid of falling downstairs, often saying she needed to install a railing. Daniel never installed it. Instead, he shoved her during an argument, making sure the fall looked like an accident. He exploited what they feared most and turned it into their final moment. As for disposal, Rowe didn't drag bodies into woods or deserts. He didn't need to. The bodies stayed right where they fell, staged as accidents in the home. He relied on investigators believing his role as grieving husband. He cried at funerals, hugged relatives, and collected insurance checks. In one case, he even convinced his late wife's family to let him move into her house, claiming it made him feel close to her. Behind closed doors, he sold the property weeks later, pocketing the money. His ability to disappear wasn't about leaving town. It was about hiding in plain sight, using his role as widower to shield himself from suspicion. For years, it worked. Police saw him as unlucky, not dangerous. 3 wives dead, all in tragic accidents, and Daniel Rowe free to hunt again. For years, Daniel Rowe thought he was smarter than everyone else. Each time one of his wives died, he stood in front of police as the grieving husband. He played his role so well that even experienced detectives pitied him. But arrogance always leaves cracks. Rowe's downfall began with the death of his 4th wife, Julia. She was younger than the others, only 32 and in perfect health. Neighbors described her as cheerful and active, the kind of woman who jogged every morning. When she was found at the bottom of her staircase with a fractured skull, police were suspicious from the start. The fall didn't match the injuries. Her head wounds suggested she had been struck before tumbling. And this time, the medical examiner didn't sign it off as an accident so quickly. The turning point came when Julia's sister pushed investigators to dig deeper. She told them about Rowe's pressure to sign life insurance papers, his sudden insistence that Julia increase the policy amount, and his cold behavior at the funeral. Detectives reopened his past. They pulled records on his previous wives. Patterns emerged like bloodstains under a blacklight. Every woman had died within 2 years of marrying him. Every woman had large life insurance policies in Rowe's name. Every death was ruled an accident. Drowning, falling, slipping, but always when Rowe was the only witness. What looked like bad luck suddenly looked like a killing spree. Police built their case carefully. They exhumed one of his earlier wives, examining her bones and tissues with updated forensic techniques. They found evidence of bruising around her neck, signs she had been held underwater. Another wife's autopsy was re-examined. The injuries didn't match a fall. They showed signs of blunt force trauma before the fall ever occurred. Slowly, Rowe's carefully crafted accidents fell apart. Investigators subpoenaed his finances and found the trail of insurance payouts. In total, Rowe had collected nearly $500,000 from his wives' deaths. He used the money to buy cars, gamble, and live well until he needed another victim to refill his pockets. But here's where it gets really interesting. Rowe made a mistake during Julia's last weeks alive. He confided in a co-worker, bragging that his wife was worth more dead than alive. The co-worker thought it was a sick joke, but when Julia died weeks later, he reported it. That statement became one of the strongest pieces of evidence at trial. The prosecution painted Rowe not as a grieving husband, but as a cold planner who lured women with love, staged their deaths, and treated them as walking bank accounts. Witnesses described his pattern of charm turning to control, then to violence. Insurance agents testified about his unusual insistence on policies. Family members told the jury about his fake tears and quick moves to sell property. Rowe's defense argued that he was just unlucky, that tragedy had followed him, not the other way around. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury didn't buy the story. They saw the bruises, the re-examined autopsies, the insurance records, the co-worker's testimony. After deliberating, they found him guilty of multiple counts of murder and insurance fraud. The judge handed down life sentences, ensuring Rowe would never walk free again. In prison, Rowe showed his true face. Gone were the crocodile tears and soft smiles. Guards described him as bitter, angry, and manipulative. He tried to charm other inmates the way he had charmed his wives, but most avoided him. His reputation spread, a man who killed women who trusted him most. He died years later behind bars, alone and forgotten, but his crimes left scars that lasted for generations. Families still spoke about him in hushed voices, warning their daughters that sometimes the most dangerous predators don't come from alleys or highways. Sometimes they come with a wedding ring, whispering promises of forever while planning your funeral. If Daniel Rowe used love as a weapon, the next killer used his trade. He wasn't a lover or a nurse. He was a butcher, and his knives weren't for meat. Most people walk into a butcher shop expecting cuts of beef, pork, or chicken. They expect the smell of raw meat, the sound of knives against wood, the friendly banter of a man in a blood-stained apron asking how thick they want their steaks. In a small town in Pennsylvania during the late 1970s, that butcher was Henry Callaway. To neighbors, he was hardworking, polite, and dedicated to his trade. But inside his shop, Callaway wasn't just slicing meat for dinner tables. He was using his blades for murder. He learned quickly that his profession gave him both tools and excuses. Knives, cleavers, saws, bone grinders, all were part of his daily routine. Blood on the floor never raised suspicion. A body could be broken down the same way as livestock, and customers would walk out with packages, never knowing what they carried. Callaway's motive was control mixed with greed. He targeted drifters, hitchhikers, and sometimes vulnerable young men who came to town looking for work. He promised them jobs in the shop, quick cash, or food in exchange for help. Once they stepped into his back room, they were trapped. Callaway worked alone, and he used the same precision he applied to cattle on human victims. His weapon of choice was the butcher's cleaver. Heavy, sharp, and silent. He struck fast, usually at the neck or skull, dropping victims before they had time to scream. For him, killing wasn't chaos. It was routine, practiced, almost mechanical. He saw people not as lives, but as carcasses to be processed. The way he lured victims showed his cunning. He'd wait near bus stations or bars, approaching men who looked tired or hungry. His offers seemed harmless. Need some work? Come by the shop. I'll pay cash. Maybe feed you. They trusted him because he was a shop owner, a man with a business, not a stranger lurking in alleys. Once inside, Callaway locked the door behind them. His shop smelled of raw meat, so the victims never noticed the scent of blood was human until it was too late. He always worked in the same spot, a tiled back room with drains in the floor. Those drains, meant for animal blood, carried away the evidence of his crimes. Disposal was his most chilling skill. Unlike other killers who struggled to hide bodies, Callaway had everything he needed: saws, grinders, freezers. Victims were cut apart with the same precision as livestock. Some parts he wrapped in butcher paper and stored in his freezers. Others he ground into unrecognizable meat, mixing it with animal scraps. Rumors later claimed he sold human flesh to customers without them knowing, though evidence was scarce. What was certain is that he made people vanish. No graves, no bones in forests, no remains left for police to find. His shop became both the killing field and the disposal site. But here's where it gets really interesting. Callaway didn't always kill in the shop. Sometimes he invited victims to his home above the store, sharing drinks or meals before leading them downstairs. One survivor, who barely escaped, described how Callaway smiled while sharpening his cleaver, telling stories about how easily flesh comes apart. That survivor ran before Callaway could strike, reporting him to police, but without evidence, nothing was done. The man was dismissed as drunk and paranoid. Meanwhile, Callaway kept hunting. His business thrived, his customers loyal, and his freezer always stocked. For years, he operated in plain sight, using his knives for more than meat, hiding his crimes behind the ordinary rhythm of a butcher's life. Henry Callaway thought he had built the perfect cover. Blood in his shop was normal. Knives, saws, freezers, all explained by his trade. Customers never questioned the smell of bleach, the locked back room, or why he kept odd hours. For years, he disposed of victims without a trace. But arrogance always leads to mistakes, and Callaway made his when he grew careless with details. One evening, a delivery driver dropped off supplies and noticed a foul smell leaking from one of Callaway's freezers. It wasn't the smell of pork or beef. It was sour, sickly, unmistakably human to anyone who had been near decay. The driver reported it to police, and soon investigators arrived with a warrant. At first, Callaway played his usual role, the calm, hard-working butcher shocked that anyone would accuse him. He gave them a tour of the shop, showing his clean front counter, his knives neatly arranged, his floor spotless. But when police opened the freezers in the back, the mask fell. Inside were packages wrapped in butcher paper, some labeled as beef or lamb. Forensics later proved many contained human remains. Even worse, investigators found bones hidden in barrels, saws with traces of blood too old to test cleanly, and a drain system clogged with human tissue. The tiled back room that had looked so ordinary revealed itself as a slaughterhouse for people. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. Police also found records. Callaway kept ledgers for his shop, but hidden within them were marks, small initials and dates that didn't match orders or deliveries. Detectives realized these were his own coded log of murders, tracking who came into the shop and never walked out. They tied those marks to missing persons reports from nearby towns, hitchhikers, transients, even a few locals who had last been seen near his store. What had once looked like disappearances suddenly looked like slaughter. The trial shocked the town. Customers who had bought meat from him filled the courtroom, some terrified that they had unknowingly eaten human flesh. Prosecutors didn't confirm cannibalism, but they did suggest it was possible, given how Callaway blended human remains with animal scraps. Families of missing men wept as forensics experts described how bones were cut with butcher precision, not hacked chaotically. One expert said he treated them exactly like livestock, down to the cuts of meat. That sentence hung in the air, turning the man everyone had trusted for dinner into a monster who blurred the line between food and murder. Callaway's defense claimed insanity, arguing that years of working with animal carcasses had broken his mind. But the jury didn't buy it. His precision, his ledgers, his ability to hide bodies for years showed calculation, not madness. Survivors testified too, including the man who had escaped while Callaway sharpened his cleaver. His words painted the clearest picture. He wasn't insane, he was proud. The verdict was swift. Callaway was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life without parole. He was sent to a maximum security prison where even hardened inmates avoided him. His reputation followed him, the butcher who had turned his trade into a slaughterhouse for people. Guards later said he never showed remorse, never admitted guilt, and often requested knives for craft projects, which were denied. He died in prison years later, taking with him the full truth of how many lives he had consumed. For the town, the damage never faded. His shop was torn down, the land left empty. No new business dared replace it. Locals avoided the block altogether, calling it cursed ground. For criminologists, Callaway became a textbook example of occupational camouflage, a killer who used his tools, his trade, and his reputation to hide in plain sight. He proved that sometimes the man carving your dinner is carving more than you'll ever want to know. If Henry Callaway used knives and freezers to make people vanish, the next killer used a badge. He wasn't a butcher or a nurse. He was a police officer who hunted. Most people fear criminals, not police officers. A badge, a uniform, flashing lights, these symbols are meant to represent safety, law, and order. But in the early 1990s, Officer Brian Keller from Texas used that very trust as his weapon. To the public, he was a patrolman who kept streets safe, a man who waved to kids and directed traffic. But to those unlucky enough to be alone on the road late at night, Keller was something else entirely. He was a predator with a badge, and he knew how to use his authority to lure, trap, and kill without suspicion. Keller's method started with traffic stops. He drove back roads and highways during his night shift, scanning for vulnerable drivers, especially women traveling alone. His police car was real, his uniform official, so when he flashed his lights, no one hesitated to pull over. Victims rolled down their windows, expecting a ticket or warning. Instead, Keller leaned in with a friendly voice, asking where they were going, if they needed help. He disarmed them with the image of a protector. But once he had them alone, far from towns or witnesses, the mask slipped. He ordered them out of the car, handcuffed them under the guise of procedure, and forced them into his patrol vehicle. By the time they realized it wasn't an arrest, it was too late. His badge had given him control without question. Why did Keller kill? Later confessions revealed a mix of thrill and domination. He admitted he felt invisible behind his badge. He believed no one would ever suspect a cop, especially in small towns where people trusted law enforcement blindly. His weapons were simple but effective: his service pistol, his baton, and sometimes his hands. He often strangled victims with handcuffs or ropes kept in his trunk. Killing by strangulation gave him control, and it left fewer ballistic traces than gunfire. Once victims were dead, he used his cruiser to transport their bodies. Disposal varied: shallow graves near rivers, abandoned barns, even wooded areas off patrol roads. Because Keller knew local search patterns, he picked spots where he was sure no one would look. The way he lured victims was chilling because it required no lies. He didn't need fake promises, dating profiles, or staged accidents. His uniform did all the work. Women obeyed his commands because disobedience to police felt unthinkable. Witnesses later recalled how Keller always volunteered for night patrols, often covering more hours than required. It wasn't dedication to duty, it was hunting time. His routine allowed him to strike repeatedly, hiding behind the excuse of just doing his job. For years, Keller's killings went unnoticed. Families reported missing loved ones, but police reports showed no connections. After all, who would suspect one of their own? Keller himself often joined search parties, pretending to help find the very victims he had dumped. He comforted families, told them he'd do everything possible, all while smiling inside, knowing the bodies lay where only he knew. But here's where it gets really interesting. Keller grew bold. He began pulling people over without reason, sometimes even in daylight. His arrogance pushed him further, and he targeted not just travelers, but also women from his own community. When two young women vanished within months of each other, both last seen after being pulled over, whispers began. Families asked why patrol cars were always around when their daughters went missing. Questions spread, but Keller's badge still protected him. It would take a mistake, a small one, to crack his armor of authority. Brian Keller's undoing came not from an elaborate investigation, but from arrogance. He believed his badge made him untouchable, and for years it did. But predators who grow too bold eventually leave cracks. Keller's mistake happened during the abduction of his final victim, a 23-year-old student named Melissa Grant. He stopped her car late one night on a rural road, following his same routine: flashing lights, calm voice, and fake arrest. But Melissa was cautious. She texted a friend as Keller walked to her window, sending the words, "Getting pulled over, Highway 9. That message became the first breadcrumb. When Melissa vanished hours later, investigators had a clear timestamp and location for her last known contact. Detectives reviewed highway cameras and traffic data. They found records of Keller's patrol car logged in the same spot at the same time. That alone didn't prove murder, but it sparked suspicion strong enough to open an inquiry. As they dug, a pattern emerged. Keller's patrol routes matched multiple missing person cases going back years. Each time someone disappeared, his car had been in the area. Internal Affairs searched his cruiser and found fibers, bloodstains, and personal items belonging to victims hidden in the trunk. Trophies he thought he'd concealed. It was the breakthrough investigators needed. The trial was a turning point. Families of the missing filled the courtroom, staring at the man they once trusted to protect them. Prosecutors laid out the evidence step by step. Patrol logs showing Keller near every disappearance, forensic results proving blood in his trunk matched Melissa and two earlier victims, and survivor testimonies from women he had harassed during traffic stops. One woman described how Keller ordered her out of the car without cause, handcuffed her, then let her go only when headlights from another vehicle approached. She survived because of timing. Others weren't as lucky. Keller's defense tried to argue contamination, coincidence, even conspiracy. But the evidence was too strong. His arrogance had turned into overkill, and it destroyed him. The jury convicted him on multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and abuse of authority. The judge handed him life without parole, calling him a predator who hid behind a badge. Keller showed no remorse, smirking as families cried, as if proud that he'd fooled them for so long. In prison, his reputation made him a target. Inmates despised him not only for being a killer, but for being a cop. He spent most of his life behind bars in isolation, stripped of the power his badge once gave him. Years later, he died in prison, but his crimes left scars on the community. Parents no longer told children to trust the police so blindly. Towns demanded body cameras, stricter patrol oversight, and new checks on officers. Keller had poisoned trust in law enforcement, proving that even those sworn to protect could become the worst predators of all. If Brian Keller twisted a badge into a weapon, the next killer twisted death itself. He didn't stalk streets. He owned a funeral home, turning grief into his hunting ground. Funeral homes are supposed to be places of dignity, a space where grief is handled with respect, where the dead are prepared for burial and the living are comforted. But for Harold Madson, a funeral director in rural Kentucky during the late 1980s, the funeral home was more than a business. It was his trap. Madson had access to two things few others did: the dead and the grieving. He realized early that families trusted him completely. They handed him bodies, gave him money, and often let him handle every detail without question. That trust became his camouflage, and within the walls of his mortuary, he began hunting not the dead, but the living. Madson's victims were often women who had recently lost husbands or parents. They were vulnerable, overwhelmed, and alone. He knew how to spot those cracks in their defenses. He played the role of the kind listener, offering comfort in soft tones, reassuring them that everything would be handled. But behind the sympathy was calculation. Madson would invite them to private rooms to discuss arrangements, closing the door behind them. Once inside, he changed. He used ropes, embalming chemicals, and even tools meant for preparing bodies as his weapons. His favorite method was suffocation, using plastic sheeting or cloth soaked in chemicals. It left little mess and no loud noise. He killed them quickly, then dragged their bodies into the embalming room, where disposal became horrifyingly easy. Unlike other killers who struggled to hide evidence, Madson had the perfect cover. His victims were already surrounded by death. If someone vanished after visiting a funeral home, it didn't raise alarms immediately. Families assumed they were grieving elsewhere. Police rarely questioned a funeral director, especially one who had been a fixture in the town for decades. Once he killed, Madson used the very tools of his trade to erase traces. He stored bodies in coffins with false names, sometimes cremated them under fake paperwork, and occasionally mixed remains with legitimate clients. Disposal was seamless. Ashes, bones, fluids, all processed under the guise of normal business. For years it worked. People disappeared and nobody connected the dots. What made Madson's crimes even darker was his motive. He didn't kill for money or lust alone. He killed for control over life and death. To him, owning the funeral home wasn't enough. He wanted to own the process of death itself, deciding who died, how they died, and how they were remembered. His lures were grief and vulnerability. His weapons were embalming tools, and his disposal methods were hidden in plain sight. Families trusted him because they had no choice. When death came, they turned to him. And for some, that trust became the last mistake they ever made. For years, Harold Madson seemed untouchable. He wore black suits, spoke softly, and carried the respect of an entire town. People trusted him because they had to. In moments of loss, he was the man who handled everything. But arrogance and routine create cracks, and Madson's empire of death eventually crumbled. His mistake began with paperwork. When a widow named Carol Jenkins disappeared after meeting him, her family grew suspicious. She had gone to the funeral home to arrange her husband's burial. Hours later, her car was still parked outside, but she was gone. Madson claimed she had left after their meeting, but police noted inconsistencies. He logged her husband's burial under a false case number, and when investigators pressed, he couldn't produce matching documents. That single error, one line of sloppy paperwork, opened the door to everything. Detectives started digging into his past clients and found multiple irregularities. Cremations without permits, coffins ordered but never delivered to cemeteries, death certificates signed with questionable details. Families reported odd moments too, loved ones vanishing after visiting Madson or being told by him that their remains had already been handled. Rumors turned into leads, and soon police searched his funeral home. What they found horrified even seasoned officers. In the embalming room, they discovered clothing and jewelry that belonged to missing women. Hidden in a storage freezer were bags of ashes that didn't match any official cremation records. Even worse, behind a false wall in the basement, they found bones, dozens of them, stored in boxes, mixed together as if human lives had been cataloged like inventory. But here's where it gets really disturbing. Forensic testing revealed some remains were of women who had never even been recorded as deceased. That meant Madson had murdered victims and processed their bodies as if they were part of his funeral business. The town was stunned. The man who had buried their families had also buried his secrets among them. The prosecution built a case around Carol Jenkins's disappearance, combined with evidence from multiple other victims. They painted Madson not as a grieving professional, but as a predator who used grief as bait. Witnesses testified about how he lured widows into his private office, how he encouraged families to leave paperwork to him, and how his cremation records were riddled with lies. At trial, Madson showed the same coldness as the others before him. He denied everything, claiming the remains were from unclaimed bodies or clerical mistakes. But the evidence was overwhelming. The hidden bones, the false paperwork, the missing women, it all fit too neatly. Survivors from families testified how their mothers or sisters vanished after visiting him, never to be seen again. When prosecutors revealed that Madson had forged cremation permits to cover up murders, the jury was done. They convicted him on multiple counts of murder, fraud, and abuse of trust. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In prison, Madson was despised. Inmates and guards alike saw him as something worse than a killer. He had preyed on the grieving, used the bodies of the dead as props, and killed women who came to him for comfort. He died behind bars years later, but his funeral home was demolished soon after his conviction. The land was left empty, a scar on the town that no business wanted to claim. His case became a dark reminder. Even in places where death should be handled with dignity, predators can twist the role into something monstrous. Madson didn't just kill. He corrupted the very rituals of life and death. These were 5 of the most ruthless killers who used their jobs as hunting grounds: a nurse who poisoned instead of healed, a lover who married to murder, a butcher who sold death in plain sight, a cop who hunted behind a badge, and a funeral director who turned grief into a weapon. Each one proves the same truth. Evil doesn't always hide in shadows. Sometimes it wears uniforms, smiles, or the tools of ordinary work. If you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe, because the next case, it might be even darker.